It's just got to be subtle in the reflection, because even in those dust areas and even in those grime areas, those materials are also reflective. It doesn't just go to zero reflectivity. Nothing in the real world behaves that way. So even dust, even grime, even things like dirt are extremely reflective. But they're just blurrier, so you don't completely get rid of reflection in those spots. It's bizarre to me because so many people do that. So many people just put black values in reflection maps and they wonder why their materials don't look realistic, and that's the reason. Everything has some level of reflectivity. So now we've varied up the reflection map just slightly, which is always going to be the case. You always want, when you're dealing with multiple materials embedded into one layered structure, you want them to be recognizable. So with that work done to the reflection map, I'm just going to do another re-render. Now, because it was so subtle what we've just done, it probably won't be visible in the render I'm about to do, but it's always good just to do it just in case, because we've added quite a few textures here. You want to make sure that you're not ruining anything in particular. Just pause it and I'll start it up when it's done. So as this render's going, I've just swapped to the reflection pass. So you see we're on the beauty before, and I've just swapped to the reflection pass just to see the difference between what we had before and now. And there's just some very subtle irregularities being introduced into the reflection. It's so subtle, but in my opinion, it all helps. You can see in this area here, we've just got a slight darkening of the reflection there. You can see in here that bit of dust is slightly less reflective. So you notice the dark spot here. That correlates to the map visible. So I'm just going to cancel that render now that you can see what the effect that has done to the shader. And we're going to move on to the next part, which is adding in the bump mapping. So if we go back into Photoshop and take a close look at the bump mapping, we can see that it's got elements from textures and elements from a procedural sense. So the first thing I'm going to do is go in and recreate the bump mapping scene around the highlight, which is kind of, we'll just use a standard Burcom noise. It doesn't need any distortion in it or anything. It's just a very simple standard bump surface. So in the shader here, I'm going to go into the bump mapping and add a composite map. And in the base layer, I'm going to make it a Burcon noise. And you're going to have to double check the scale of things. So what I'm going to do is, same thing I did last week, is basically, sorry, let me just get this visible here. Same thing as last week, I'm just going to make a V-Ray light material. Copy this noise. And just get a test of where we're at. Okay, so one problem we've got here is that the bump's too small. Now I'm going to let you know about something that all shaders need to happen here, and it's extremely important. And what that is you need large scale bump. So basically on this surface, or should I say on my model, if we go back to max, it's a perfect sphere. There's no noise or distortion in that sphere. However, in our reference here, you can see that that's not the case with the model. So if I make a new layer, I can highlight that to you, because this highlight you'd expect if it was a perfect surface, it would just be a nice, sorry, let me make that more visible. You'd expect that to just be a nice hard edge like that. But instead, if we zoom in, there's all sorts of undulations and variation in the surface that's this soft, subtle, large-scale bump. So what we need to do is we need to layer the bump, working up from the bigger procedurals down to the smaller ones. So I'm going to set the size of this to 2 and re-render. And now what that's going to do is it's going to warp the surface on a much larger scale, but I can still go bigger with that. So I'm going to set it to 3, which is perfect. I'm going to go back out and make this a composite map. I'm going to make a new layer, drag this one over the top as a copy, and change the scale of it. So now I'm going to set the scale of this to be 0.5. And if I drop the opacity down to 80, what you'll see happen is we get elements from the large bump blending in through this new smaller bump. So even though it's such a subtle difference, 20% of this bump is still visible in this texture, and it will distort the surface accordingly. You will still get those large scale ripples in the surface. I'm going to go down just a little bit more, just so it's a bit more visible, and I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to use the same type of map again. One thing I need to do though first is I need to add a little bit more detail to this, but we don't need to add much. All I need to really do is just add a little fractal through it, and you can see that just gives you a bit of extra detail there. So now if I duplicate this over the top again, I want to make it this smaller layer, which I'm going to set to 0.2 to give you even more tiny frequency details, and I'm going to really minimize the effect that has on the map. Okay, lastly, all we need to do is incorporate the reflection glossiness map into the bump. So I'm going to go back out, I'm going to go into the material we were setting up, and in the diffuse component I'm going to steal this top map, this thumbprint map that we already put the output on. I'm going to go back into the Burcon map and paste that in as an instance. And now I multiply that over, I get those same bumps happening. Okay, so let me just copy that composite setup now, and I'm going to paste it into the bump, and you can see the effect that has on the surface. So if I go into the bump and you look at the final result here, if I turn off these layers, you can see on the base layer we've got that large scale rippling happening. Then when we add the top layer, it blends some more detail through that, and then again we blend more detail, and finally we blend detail from the texture. Now the default value of 30 is too strong, and it's a very subtle bump, so I'm going to reduce that to 5. And now we can see if I increase this preview, we're getting a bump that very closely resembles the Photoshop file. Getting that noise, that kind of rough surface noise. So I'm going to do a test render of that and show you where we're at, and we'll continue from there. So as that's rendering, I don't need to let it finish again, because I can see here on the highlights that I'm happy with what it's doing. It's producing a very close interpretation of what was going on in the reference image. But the bump's probably just a little bit too strong. So I'm just going to cancel the render, and instead of setting it to 5, I'm going to set it to 4. And and just drop it 20%. Okay, so this base shader has a lot of different stuff going on in it now, but we haven't set the reflection glossiness. So that'll be the next thing I set up. And just like last week where I showed you that trick where you can turn the glossiness on and off to see the difference between the mapped version and the procedural version, I'm going to do that again. So actually I've just loaded in that metal, but really what I should have done is just copy it from somewhere else. So I'm going to put an output map on this, keep the old as the submap, and where I've just loaded that texture in a kind of lazy way, what I need to do is I need to steal it from somewhere else as an instance. So in the diffuse, I can go to that metal, there it is, I can copy that, and I can paste it as an instance. And now that I've got this loaded as an output map, pasting that as an instance doesn't affect what I'm about to do here. So I can enable the color map and readjust that. So taking a look at the preview while that loads, the default value is quite off, and we need to get it closer to what it was set to manually, which was 0.8. So I'm going to just adjust that to work. So on this top point, I'm going to set it to 0.8 and just compare it with the off version. So you can see we're a bit too spread. That's with the map and without the map. I'm just looking over here. So I need to go up. See, it's a little bit sensitive. So still a bit too spread. And now we're too small. And that's much better. So I just need to do a test render of that map with the glossiness enabled, and then we can move on to some of the final process, which is getting those layered reflections happening. And we did it in a different way this time because some things were more obvious than others. So with this material, the diffuse was a lot more obvious to match than the coding materials you're about to see take place. So let me just get this render out of the way, and then we can move on to that final stage, which is setting up the top two layers of the shader. So now that that's rendered, one problem I'm noticing is that there's too much contrast in places, and we're ending up with a really dirty surface, which wasn't my intention. My intention was to increase the glossiness in a few little areas so that we got things like this happening. But what's actually happened is it's ended up just doing it everywhere. So what I need to do is I need to go into the reflection glossiness map and just soften those details off a little bit more. So if I load the texture here, you can see there's a large amount of dark areas. So what I can do to fix that is I can just, let me just undo that. I had both selected. If I just select this map and just roll the curve off a little more, it's just softened that off. So I'm just going to double check against without the map again. And it's close enough. So I've got to do another test render now to double check it's all good. So as that's rendering, you can see that issue's kind of been fixed a little bit now. Whereas before, areas like this were extremely dark and blurry. They've just been toned back a little bit, which brings it into the realm of realism a little bit more. So I don't need to finish that render. I can cancel that, and we can move on to creating the multiple layers. So I'm going to drag this shader over now, and we're going to separate them into their different components. You can see down the bottom the finished material is structured the same way. So we need to go in and adjust a couple of things. Now, the difference is with this material, like I was saying at the start of the lesson, is that that top coat is behaving a little bit differently. The reflection color is going to be a little bit closer to white, and there's going to be less of a metallic vibe to that because it's just what we're seeing. Not every material is going to be the exact same, and on this top coat, I personally believe that it's a sprayed over coating, like a protective coating that's made it more shiny and more plasticky. So we're going to keep that in mind this time because they're not going to have the same reflection map for that top layer. We're going to treat this material a little bit more like car paint. So the second layer, so we've got here the base. I'm just going to rename that. I'm going to name this one Top Coat 1. And this Top Coat 2. In the reflection glossiness, I'm just going to re-instance the texture. So in the glossiness here, I'm going to steal this metal and paste that as an instance into both of those layers. Now I need to adjust the glossiness of this middle coat. So as I'm adjusting that, I was just taking a look at this shader preview here, and I was just thinking that it looks a little bit too contrasty, like it could be the wrong map being used for the glossiness. I've loaded in this metal, but what I think is going to work better is using the fingerprint glossiness map. So I'm just going to steal that from this base, just go into the base here, go into the diffuse, and that fingerprint glossiness map up here, I'm going to steal that and put that into the glossiness of this new material. Now if I load up the larger preview, there's less grunge and dirtiness in the glossiness amount. The reason I did that is because I was looking through the shader here and it's actually pretty smooth, the glossiness. It's pretty even throughout the whole material. So sometimes you just need to be aware of things like that and constantly look back at the reference and judge for yourself what's working and what's not. But this top coat, we just need to make it a little tighter. Okay, and then on the So now we get to the important part, which is this top material. Now this top material, if we go into the reflection map, and down the very base of that, we can see that there's a massive difference between the red, green, and blue wavelengths. So we need to make this reflection color be a little bit clearer. So what we do there is we select those points, and if we just drag them up a little bit, and drag the red down a little bit, it's going to push it more towards a even white color, as opposed to that strong red color. So I'm going to adjust the glossiness of this. And now this top coat is going to be really, really glossy. It's not going to be blurry at all. So we need to adjust that map, and I'm going to put it to 0.998 at the very top. Just kind of load it up, high res, just to see what it's doing. And I'm going to introduce a little bit more color into the reflection. I just took out a little bit too much. So I'm going to bump up the red. Sorry, I accidentally missed one point. Just going to bump that red up a little bit. Okay, so we haven't done any tests with these new layers, and this material is too difficult to go through one by one, rendering each layer and figuring out how much contribution it needs to make towards the scene. So let's go in. I'm going to go out all the way back to this base material we've just created and make it a blend material. And now we can just drag the coat materials over the top there. And now we need to start blending them in. You can see by default, when we blend them all evenly together, but 50% gray, we start getting that effect happening where the center is really glossy and the edge is really spread, but we're not blending them with the correct amounts. So what I'll do is I'm just going to set up a quick fall off map in each slot there and do a test render, and then we can adjust it accordingly. So as you know, I'll just repeat, this blend map, all that's doing is it's telling the blend material how much of this top coat needs to get blended through with the base coat. So at a facing angle, it's blending that first top coat. 70% of that top coat is getting blended through, and as we go more towards the edge, it goes up to 100%. Just going to copy that map over, just call it coat 1 and coat 2. Bring up a preview of the finished material. And now we're at a point where we can do a test render to figure out how spread those lobes should be, those specular lobes should be. So as that's rendering, what I'm seeing is that we don't have a good enough lighting setup in the scene to truly match what's happening in the photo. So back in the photo, we've got this really strong light down here that's close to the surface and is really pinging off, whereas in our render, we don't have that. So I can't tell yet if the shader's behaving correctly. So I'm just going to cancel that render and I'm just going to move the light closer and make it stronger so that it has a more profound effect on the surface. As that's rendering, you can see we've got it pretty close, but the bump map's wrong. Now that there's a stronger light source on there, which wasn't there before, I'm noticing that it's incorrectly adding too much detail in the bump. So back in Photoshop, if I zoom in, the bump's a lot more subtle, so I need to decrease the intensity of it, and it's just cleaner. There's less random stuff going on that's causing irregularities. So I'm just going to cancel the render and go back into this material. Now in the base coat, the bump stays the same for all layers, so I can copy that and paste it as an instance. And I'm going to reduce the intensity to 2. And I'm also going to go into this third layer here, which has all that little micro detail, and reduce the effect of that to 4. Now because I've just instanced them, that's affecting all 3 layers of the shader, and I don't need to worry about that affecting things. I don't have to worry about redoing that for all 4 of them. So just see what that looks like after it's rendered. So the render's finished, and the little bit of bloom and glare I've placed over the top adds that extra last little bit of realism. Now this shader is a little bit slow to render, and that's always going to be the case when you're using multi-layered metal shaders. There's just a lot going on, and you can see the results in the shader though. So like I was saying last week, even major studios aren't using these techniques, so you've got a really good opportunity to boost your work output and boost the quality of all your shaders using this method if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of render time. Now I'm just about to wrap this video up, but I just thought I'd let you guys know that I've just recently resigned from my job to take this full time. So I'm loving doing it. And like I said, from the very first lesson, I was only just getting started, and I had major plans for this. Now I've already, and we're probably about 6 months out from finishing the course, and I've already started to plan the major finale for that. So I'll start releasing like sneak peeks of it. But basically my goal is for the end of this course, you should be able to produce work that's the same quality as mine, if not better, and not just copying what I'm doing, but actually understanding the thought process behind these techniques, and really like trying to get a hold of the technical aspects of V-Ray and making that a subconscious part of your workflow. You shouldn't have to sit there and think about, is my Fresnel curve the correct value, or is my glossiness map right? It should all just become creative, and that's what's happened for me in the last 6 months since doing this course. All of this because I've had to cement it into my brain, everything that's going on. I'm starting to forget about the technical side and just treat things creatively. You get a little bit more intuitive about things, and I think as I teach you guys more and more about how V-Ray's working and all the different little tips and tricks to get renders a little bit better, that you'll really start to see the results in that. So once again, we've got over 300 people now on the course, so there's a little bit of pressure on me to keep the quality up, but don't worry, pretty soon in the next few weeks I'll be at home. I'll have a full render farm, I'll have a brand new workstation, so all the money from the course I'm just investing back into improving it and trying to treat this as a long-term career change for myself. So once again, thanks heaps everyone. I'll see you next lesson. Don't have an ETA on that yet, but next lesson will be an introduction to V-Ray 3.0. It's going to go over some of the techniques we learned in lesson 1 and change them for version 3 to really get the render times down a little bit further once again. So thanks heaps, and I'll see you next time.